Hello, my name is Guillaume Loubet. I'm currently a postdoc at EPFL in Switzerland, working with Wenzel Jakob from EPFL and Nicolas Holzschuch from INRIA. And in this video, I'm going to present our recent publication at SIGGRAPH Asia about differentiable rendering. When we have a virtual scene with geometry, material models, textures, lights, and a camera, we know very well how to simulate the scattering of light in the virtual scene in order to produce a realistic image. The rendering algorithm can be seen as a function that takes some input, the parameters of the virtual scene, and it produces some output, the pixel values of the rendered image. But sometimes we have an image, for instance a photo, and we would like to reconstruct a virtual scene from this image. This is often called inverse rendering, and it's very challenging because every pixel value depends on many parameters and there are many ambiguities in the reconstruction. Differentiable rendering is one way of solving these complex inverse rendering problems. If we have a target photo, we can start from an approximate scene that we can render. We can define an error metric that quantifies the quality of the current scene. And if we're able to compute the partial derivatives of this error with respect to each parameter in the scene, then we can do a gradient descent. That means we can do steps in the space of the parameters in order to improve the scene. And typically we do this iteratively until the parameters of the scene converge. What's difficult in this pipeline is the computation of the partial derivatives with respect to each parameter. It's difficult because it means that we cannot use any renderer in this pipeline. We have to use a differentiable renderer that allows us to compute the partial derivatives of pixel values with respect to the scene parameters. So let's have a look at these partial derivatives of pixel values. For each parameter in the scene, for instance, a parameter controlling the translation of this cube or the orientation of the light, there is a corresponding image that contains the partial derivatives. And these derivatives basically tell us whether the pixel values are increasing or decreasing when we change the corresponding parameter. Let's have a look at a concrete inverse rendering problem that can be solved with a differentiable renderer and gradient descent. Here we started from a photo of a footstep on the surface of the moon, and we want to reconstruct the geometry of the surface from this photo. We decided to start from a flat diffuse surface, and we optimized for the height of the vertices. Now you can see the surface being optimized. With a few steps, the algorithm finds a surface such that the rendered image looks more like the target image. Note that the renderer should be able to simulate whatever happens in the photo in terms of light scattering, such as shadows or multiple scattering. Now let's have a look at the computation of the partial derivatives of pixel values with respect to scene parameters. In physically based rendering, pixel values are defined with integrals. For instance, the integral of the incident radiance on the sensor inside the box filter. And we want to compute the partial derivatives of these integrals. In physically based rendering, these integrals have no analytic solutions. So instead of computing exactly the value of these integrals, renderers rely on Monte Carlo integration. Some samples are drawn in the integration domain, and an estimate E of the integral is obtained by averaging the contributions of the samples. The estimate E converges to the value of the integral I if we add more samples. We're interested in computing partial derivatives of I, the integral. So the question is, could we simply differentiate the Monte Carlo estimate E to estimate the partial derivatives of I? And the answer is yes, sometimes. Sometimes the integrand is differentiable with respect to a scene parameter pi. This is the easy case. This happens, for instance, when the parameter pi defines the color of a surface. Here look at what happens in this integrand at each sample position when pi varies. The integrand varies continuously at each Monte Carlo sample. So the integrand is differentiable. In this case, if we differentiate the Monte Carlo estimate E, we obtain an unbiased estimate of the partial derivatives of the integral. This comes from the fact that when the integrand is differentiable, we can mathematically swap the partial derivative sign and the integral sign. But sometimes we need to differentiate with respect to a parameter that affects the positions of discontinuities in the integrand. For instance, here, the integrand is clearly not differentiable with respect to this scene parameter pi, since discontinuities move with respect to the Monte Carlo samples. In other words, the value of the integrand can have jumps at a given Monte Carlo sample. So in this case, differentiating the standard Monte Carlo estimate does not give an estimate of the partial derivatives of the integral. Mathematically, this comes from the fact that we cannot swap the partial derivative sign and the integral sign when the integrand is not differentiable. These non-differentiable integrands are everywhere in a physically based renderer, not only in pixel integrals, but also in light integrals and BSDF integrals. Here, for instance, when the cube translates, all these integrands have moving discontinuities, which means that we cannot easily differentiate standard Monte Carlo estimates. This problem of non-differentiable integrands has been addressed by several researchers in different ways, by computing analytically the visibility of triangles or by blurring the primitives in world space or image space. None of this method is satisfying in the context of a modern differentiable path tracer with complex materials and indirect effects such as shadows and multiple scattering. Only recently, the first fully differentiable path tracer has been introduced by Lee and colleagues. The idea is to sample integrands using standard Monte Carlo samples, but also additional samples around the discontinuities. And they show in the paper that with these two types of samples, we can compute unbiased estimates of partial derivatives, either using automatic differentiation or analytic derivatives. But this technique requires sampling of discontinuities in all the integrands. For instance, for integrating the incident radiance at a shading point in the scene, we need to sample the silhouette edges that create discontinuities in the integrand. This can be done using a 6D data structure, and it works well if the scene is relatively simple. But the sampling of silhouette edges becomes the bottleneck and the main source of variance when the scene has complex geometry and non-trivial visibility. Our main motivation for this project was to design a differentiable path tracer that does not require the sampling of silhouette edges. To explain our approach, I will start with this very simple 1D example. Here, we are looking at the integral of a smooth function k in blue times a step function, and the position of the step is determined by a parameter p. And we are interested in computing the partial derivative of the integral I with respect to p. Clearly, in this case, the integrand is not differentiable with respect to p. Intuitively, the discontinuity moves with respect to the Monte Carlo samples. Our intuition to solve the problem was the following. Maybe we can use the degree of freedom we have for drawing the Monte Carlo samples, and if we manage to sample them such that they follow the discontinuity when p varies, then we solve the problem because the value of the integrand at the positions of the sample is now differentiable. Mathematically, this corresponds to applying a change of variable to the integral that looks like a translation in this case. In this new integral, we see that the position of the discontinuity does not depend on p anymore, which means that the integrand is now differentiable. It means that now we can use standard Monte Carlo integration for estimating partial derivatives. Note that after this change of variable, the value of the integral is exactly the same. The positions of the samples are the same. The only difference is the partial derivatives of the integrand at the sampled positions. The same idea can be used to get rid of discontinuities in 2D integration problems. Here we want to integrate a discontinuous function times a smooth function in blue. That could be a pixel filter or a BRDF. If the discontinuity moves with respect to Monte Carlo samples, when pi varies, the integrand is not differentiable. But in this case, we can find very simple changes of variables such that the samples follow the discontinuity and the integrand becomes differentiable. Now, when we have a virtual scene, things are a bit more complex. There are various objects controlled by different parameters, and if we want to integrate this function, clearly there is no simple change of variable that could make the integrand differentiable. The samples cannot follow all these discontinuities at the same time. But if we zoom in this integrand, things of course become simpler. And if we zoom in off, almost everywhere we are looking at the boundary of a single object, and in this case we can make the integrand locally differentiable with some assumptions that we discuss in the paper. So what we need is a way to control the scale at which we apply our changes of variables. For this, we rely on a property of spherical integrals. The integral of a function over the sphere is equal to the integral of a convolution of this function. And this is true for any convolution filter. We show in the paper that this idea can be extended to other integration domains. Using this idea, instead of sampling directly integrals with a large support, we sample a convolution of the integrand, which is itself an integral, and we can choose arbitrarily the size of the convolution kernel. So the trick is to apply our changes of variables to the convolution integral in red and not to the primary integral in blue. Note that we are estimating exactly the same integral, but we sample it in a way that's more convenient for our problem. Based on these techniques, we can build a differentiable renderer. In each integral, for instance pixel integrals, we first sample some rays to gather some information about the discontinuities in the integrand. Note that we don't need to sample exactly the discontinuities. From this information, we estimate a change of variable such that the integrand becomes differentiable, and then we sample the integral by reusing a ray from the previous step. Our algorithm performs similarly for other types of integrals, light integrals and BRDF integrals. Here we compare partial derivatives obtained with our method with reference partial derivatives computed with finite differences. Note that we obtain very accurate derivatives for different parameters, here rotation, translation and scale of the object. Also note that if we don't apply any change of variable, the results are completely wrong because moving discontinuities are neglected. Our technique can be used in any type of integrals in the differentiable path tracer. For instance, we can differentiate glossy reflections, shadows, and refraction. Here we compare with the edge sampling technique using a black object to focus on discontinuities. In this example, with the translating teapot with glossy reflections, the two methods produce similar results. The edge sampling technique is often better in the case of discontinuities that are visible directly from the camera, while our method is slightly more robust in glossy reflections in this example. If we subdivide this teapot in order to increase the number of edges, we can observe that the edge sampling technique lacks robustness in glossy reflections. When the scene has many edges, it becomes very challenging to identify the silhouette edges that contribute to partial derivatives. To the contrary, our method produces the same result as before because it does not require the sampling of silhouette edges. Note that the computation time was the same for these two images, approximately 1 second. The difference between the two techniques is even more visible in the case of intricate geometry. The lack of robustness of the edge sampling technique can also be observed in shadows. In this case, our method is at the same time faster and more robust. To validate our differentiable renderer, we solved challenging inverse rendering problems. In this example, we rendered an object using 5 different points of view, and we reconstruct the shape and the texture of the object from these 5 images. We jointly optimized the displacement of the surface and the texture using a coarse-to-fine approach to avoid local minima. In this example, we solve a similar problem, but the target images are photos. Again, we start with an approximate shape and jointly optimize a displacement map and a texture. We implemented our technique using Mitsubatu that has been presented at SIGGRAPH Asia as well. Our differentiable renderer runs on the GPU, it relies on automatic differentiation, and it uses optics for ray intersections. The code will be released on GitHub. One of the main limitations of our method is the bias of the estimators of partial derivatives. The bias is typically small compared to the magnitude of the partial derivatives in a given optimization problem. We have been able to solve challenging inverse rendering problems with our technique. The role of bias in stochastic gradient descent is not completely understood. Note that unbiased estimates is not necessarily the main goal for a differentiable renderer. We just need the partial derivatives to guide the optimization to some minimum. In this video, I haven't discussed variance reduction for partial derivatives, but this is really a key ingredient of our method. We proposed the variance reduction technique based on control variates, and it's very efficient in many important cases. It could be improved in others. This is the end of this video. I would like to thank Tsumoli for useful discussions and for helping with comparisons. I also thank all the Mitsubatu team for their support during this project, and feel free to contact me if you have any question about the project.